right. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the fertilizer pollution cycle, and I am Christian Wagley with Healthy Gulf, and I'm the coastal organizer for Florida and Alabama. I'm based in Pensacola, but Healthy Gulf is based in New Orleans, and we're the only nonprofit that really works Gulf-wide in all five Gulf states. And we work on a variety of issues related to the waterways and the communities all along the Gulf Coast, from endangered species to water pollution issues. And increasingly, we're involving the people side of things in our work. I think if you know about, a lot of the traditional conservation work was always around the critters, and the animals and such. And increasingly, we're also concerned about the people and the communities along the Gulf Coast and making sure that they're protected as well. And that certainly ties in with what our topic is this evening. I'm joined by a couple of my Healthy Gulf colleagues who I'll introduce in just a moment, but just a couple of announcements about this evening and how we're going to do things. Just for the good of the order, everybody is muted, but we really want to hear your questions and feedback. So the chat is wide open to use for that. So we'll be monitoring the chat and we'll take questions at the end for about the last 15 minutes or so. From questions from Matt at the end. And this is going to be a 1 hour presentation, so we'll respect your time with that. So probably about 45 minutes of presentation and about 15 minutes of questions. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce my two colleagues who are joining us this evening. One is Rebecca Malpass, who is a Tulane University graduate. She has a background in conservation, and she's currently working as a policy intern with Healthy Gulf. And she's going to be the one that's going to collect your questions in the chat, and she'll be the one that'll facilitate those and ask those questions of Matt at the end. So please don't be shy with your questions. We want to hear them. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our featured presenter this evening, my colleague, our colleague, Matt Rota. Matt's the Senior Policy Director for Healthy Gulf. Over the past 15 years, he's advocated for healthy waters throughout the Gulf region and specifically along the Mississippi River as well. Matt focuses on policy and regulatory water issues in this region and nationally as well. He's given numerous presentations on water pollution issues, including the dead zone, the wetland protection, sewage pollution, and the BP oil drilling disaster at both professional and technical conferences around the country. So with that, we welcome Matt Rota. And Matt, take it away.
Hey, thanks, y'all. I'll be starting the presentation in a minute. Hey, Christian, we were having trouble getting things up on the Facebook Live, and I finally found the live button, but it's probably too late for me to do anything with it. But it's there on the Healthy Gulf page if you want to try it again. But anyway, yay, technology and COVID times. Let me get my little presentation up here. Thing. All right. Let me move this out of the way so I can see my presentation. Make it nice and big for y'all. Hey, so yeah, my name is Matt Rota, and I am the Senior Policy Director for Healthy Gulf. And I've been with Healthy Gulf for going on 16 years now, I think, and I've been so dedicating this part of my life to protecting and restoring and the communities and the ecosystems around the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the issues that I have been dealing with for basically my entire career here, and in fact, this is one of the issues that that Healthy Gulf was working on from the beginning, from when we were founded in 1995, is this idea of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, or fertilizer pollution, or nutrient pollution. So today I'm going to, but we always talk about parts of it. We talk about the phosphogypsum piles that are collapsing in Florida and Louisiana. We talk about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. We talk about polluted drinking water in the Midwest. We talk about the Des Moines waterworks and how they have to have one of the most sophisticated water treatment facilities because of the fertilizer pollution that goes into the two rivers that they get their drinking water from. But this really is a cycle, and it's a cycle that impacts the Gulf many times over. And so what I wanted to do today is we've developed this tool, this story map, to go through this whole cycle and to really show all of the different ways that this pollution impacts the ecosystem and the communities around the Gulf of Mexico. And at the end, I'm going to be sharing a link to this. This is a tool that everybody can use, and I'm kind of just when you're walking through it, but it's something that can be shared far and wide. And I encourage folks after this presentation to take a look and start playing with it. But I was a high school teacher in a former life, and I know if you hand out something right at the beginning of a presentation, nobody's going to be paying attention to your presentation. They're all going to be playing with it. So I will give you a link at the end of my presentation, and then we'll be sharing it out. We'll put it on our blog and things like that as well. So you'll be able to find it if you have to jump off early. But I want to make sure you're looking at this guy right here for a little while. So fertilized to death. There are, like I said, we are impacted by nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, fertilizer pollution, so many times here in the Gulf of Mexico. And it is a crisis. EPA calls nitrogen phosphorus pollution one of the biggest pollution problems in the country right now. We're hearing about red tides off the coast of Florida every year. We've had these algae crises, and most recently in the news, a pile of fertilizer waste almost collapsed into Tampa Bay, and actually still had to put thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of gallons of water into the bay that was polluted. So this is something that's really impacting us. So I just wanted to walk everybody through it. So first of all, I wanted to show you all, just take a minute to show about a minute long video that really just starts to go over the cycle in a very brief way, kind of an elevator pitch, and then we'll start digging into some of this stuff. So first of all, phosphorus rock is mined in Florida for phosphorus fertilizer. Here you can see a massive pile of the fertilizer waste, this phosphate waste. And nitrogen fertilizer is made from natural gas. And so that natural gas is mined in the Gulf of Mexico, and lots of different problems associated with that. And then also it is fracked in Texas and throughout the country, where we get a lot of our natural gas now. There's a lot on the market and has threats to the groundwater, threats to surface water, and then the climate change obviously as well. This all goes to nitrogen phosphorus fertilizer plants and impacts these communities in those areas. And a lot of these plants are in Louisiana, Texas, Florida. Then that fertilizer is going to be shipped up to the Midwest a lot, where it's going to be applied on fields. That fertilizer doesn't get taken up by all the plants, and it runs off and flows back down to the Gulf of Mexico. But before it does, it can cause lots of problems in these areas by causing algae blooms and things like that. And finally, it comes back down to the Gulf and causes algae to bloom in the Gulf of Mexico, which causes the Gulf dead zone, which is an area where the dissolved oxygen gets so low that sea life needs to swim away, or it's going to die, like this little dead crab that we have a picture here. So that was a very quick overview. That's what I'm going to be talking about today, is that cycle. And we call it the fertilizer pollution cycle, a death cycle, because it's it causes problems when it starts here, and then those problems end up coming right back here. So now I want to just walk you all through a few things. So we're going to take a closer look. Here is, you see, Florida, and hey, can y'all see my pointer if I'm moving around, or is that there? Good. Thanks for the nods. Great. So we have phosphate mining in Florida. Florida is the place where we get most of our phosphorus. We also get it from Russia and a few other places around the country, but in the United States, it's mined in Florida, and this is a dirty operation. And we can see, zoom in a little bit, the areas that are around Tampa. These are all these fertilizer mines. And remember, once again, you guys can play with this as much as you want after this. So if I'm breezing over things, please put any questions you have in the chat. But also, this is a tool that is intended for people to use. So we have those there, and then we have one big one up in North Florida. And you'll see with this, I'm going to be going through this. I'm not going to be reading this out to y'all. This is a tool that's also doesn't need to be narrated by me. It probably helps to be narrated, but it doesn't need to be. And so you'll be able to go back to this and look at all of this stuff. So you have this phosphate that is mined in Florida, and that's the bare bones. Every plants need here NPK for fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we're going to be talking about nitrogen and phosphorus mainly in this presentation, because that's really what drives these algae blooms, really drives these other pollution issues. So it's mined in Florida, and runoff from these areas can pollute the drinking water there. It can also cause and exacerbate the red tides that happen in Florida. You've probably heard over the years, the red tides it's a type of microorganism, Carina brevis, that forms, and it can cause respiratory issues, can cause animal mortality, and it seems to be getting worse and worse in Florida, and it occurs basically all along the Florida Gulf Coast, and it's kind of central to South Florida is where the most impacts are. These mines also can have impacts to endangered species. We have 2 endangered species that these mines are right on top of. First of all is the oval pigtoe mussel that lives in waterways that are around the mines in northern Florida. And then the Florida panther. Here's the habitat of the Florida panther. So you can see that this really impedes and encroaches on the endangered Florida panther. So that's one of the sources of this phosphorus, the feedstock for phosphorus fertilizer. Now then you have nitrogen fertilizer, and we use natural gas to make nitrogen fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process to make the synthetic fertilizer was developed, I think, in the 1960s, and it is just really increased since then. And this nitrogen, phosphorus, nitrogen pollution has also increased since then. So here in this map, you can see this is the network of pipelines that crisscross throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So we're just littered with these pipelines. To give another perspective, here are all of the wells that are drilled. These are all the platforms and such throughout the Gulf. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these platforms that are out there drilling for oil and gas. And then, again, that's networked all the way through the Gulf. And we're going to talk about the networks of the pipelines throughout the rest of the country in just a second. The other place where we get our natural gas is through fracking. Now, this program probably would have crashed if I would have loaded up all of the oil and gas wells throughout the whole country. So I restricted it to the Gulf states, the 5 Gulf states, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. So this is a map of all of the oil and gas wells on land. And it looks like we just colored over there with a black pen, but these are actually all small black dots. There's just so many throughout these areas, and can really have impact. We've talked about fracking having issues with contaminating groundwater, air pollution, and also this fracking has these emissions that can exacerbate climate change. So first of all, you can see here are the areas where fracking is taking place or could be taking place throughout the Gulf. These are different plays of natural gas and oil throughout the Gulf states. Once it's mined, or once it's drilled, we need to get it somewhere. And so this natural gas gets shunted across the nation for all the different uses we have for natural gas, from heating to the development of synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizer. So here's the map of all of those throughout the country. So and you can just see how concentrated these are in the Gulf states and the disproportionate impact that we have down here. And so goes in from those pipelines, and where does it go? It goes to the fertilizer plants. And here you can see a map of all of the fertilizer plants throughout the states. And I'll throw up the table here, the what do you call that? The table of contents, that's what it is. Or key, and we have the nitrogen, phosphorus, and then potash is another kind of fertilizer, but we only have like 2 potash fertilizer plants in the country. So it's mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. So if it's phosphorus, it's probably coming from Florida. If it's nitrogen, that natural gas is probably coming from the Gulf, or good chance it is coming from one of the Gulf states, especially Texas and Louisiana. So it's all essentially these plants, and these are not benign things. The plants are concentrated in different areas where they have lots of impacts. One of the impacts that has been in the news lately is gyp stacks, or phosphogypsum stacks, or phosphogypsum piles. They're called different things depending on where you are and where you see them. But whenever they use this phosphogypsum to make fertilizer, they have to use acid and other chemicals to basically get the fertilizer out of that phosphorus ore. And it results in this byproduct, phosphogypsum. And they basically store this in big, huge piles. And when I say huge piles, these piles can be 100, 200, more than 200 feet tall. Sometimes they're the tallest thing within a few hundred miles of them. And this waste has highly acidic, and it's also contains natural radioactive materials in it, radium-226, uranium. And these are just, the thing is, we don't know what to do with it. There's no thought has been given, since these have been built, since before the 60s, as to what to do with this waste. And so that it just piles up. They become these huge ponds just waiting to collapse. And we saw this in Piney Point, Florida, and we saw this at the Uncle Sam phosphogypsum stack in Louisiana. And here's the stacks that we have in the Gulf. And all of these are just waiting, ticking time bombs to be to collapse. So many of them are within flood zones, potential impacts of hurricanes, or they're just getting old. The one that happened in Piney Point has been open for a long time, and it just developed a leak near the bottom. And so thousands and thousands of gallons of this wastewater flows into our local streams, or flows into the Mississippi River, flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I want to bring your attention a little bit to a particular area in Louisiana that's a particular note, and that is the area known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And it's basically the area between Baton Rouge, a little bit above Baton Rouge, down to the mouth of the Mississippi River. And this is an area that has a very high concentration of industrial activity. It is also a very high concentration of African American communities. We have African freedmen communities there, and it's a area of quite a bit of environmental racism, where communities of color are disproportionately impacted compared to other communities throughout the state, throughout their parishes or counties, or throughout the United States. And this is just a quick picture to show you how much waste these communities are dealing with. Just millions and millions and millions of pounds of toxins that are released into the air and water and land to these communities. And we're also talking about this polluted water goes into the Mississippi River, and who drinks the water from the Mississippi River? I do. From the Mississippi River down here in New Orleans, we drink that water. And so it's really far-reaching impacts. And I'll talk a little bit about the nitrogen and phosphorus, how especially nitrogen has impacts to drinking water issues. But it's important to see, especially when we're talking about the industrial side of this pollution, that it's really disproportionately impacts poor African American, Black and brown communities a lot more than it does other folks, and it's obvious environmental impacts to these communities that have already borne a disproportionate amount of the impact for all of this development. And this is just another classic example of where these ammonia plants, which are fertilizer plants, where these phosphorus plants, where these nitrate plants are right on top of these communities that, these areas are full, and we should not be expanding, and we should be figuring out how to close these facilities down. All right, so we've mined our fertilizer. We've made it into a fertilizer that can actually be used to put on the crops, and so much of it gets sent up the Mississippi River throughout the area to be applied in areas of the Midwest. And the crop that really takes the most of this nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer, especially nitrogen fertilizer, is corn. Corn is very intensive as far as how much fertilizer it takes up, and it's very leaky in that it doesn't use a lot of the fertilizer that's applied to it. So a lot of that water will flow off and get into local waters, get into the water table and things like that. This map here is just basically showing what percentage of the agricultural land in these different areas is corn. And so you can really see the blue outline is the Mississippi River drainage. And so up there, the I states, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, where really is the concentration, the corn belt, the red basket, those kinds of things are really a lot of the sources of where they experience a lot of this pollution from the fertilizer that's applied to these different areas. And this fertilizer application, this could deserve its own 45-minute talk as well, talking about how we farm, how we drain wetlands to make these crops, how doing monoculture or just corn on soybean is not only has problems with fertilizer pollution, but soil loss, soil health. There are so many things that I could dig into this as well, and maybe that will be something for another presentation. But I want to stick to the impacts of this fertilizer and kind of continue this this journey that we had a phosphorus rock that was mined, shipped to Louisiana, and worn down by chemicals to leaving harmful byproducts where nitrogen is created through natural gas, where it's mined and pollutes the air with ammonia and other things before it's shipped up, gets applied to the land. And here's a nice little graph of how much we've been using. Remember I said in 1960 we developed a process to make fertilizer out of natural gas? Well, hey, look what happened with all the nitrogen fertilizer we started applying. So this gets into the water. This just shows us all of the waters in the United States that are considered polluted or impaired. So you can't even see all of the different waters. They just kind of mush all together because we have so many polluted waters in the United States, and a very large percentage of those is due to nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, due to fertilizer pollution. So when this gets into surface water, this fertilizer, it makes things grow, right? And so you have this fertilizer gets into the water and it causes these algae blooms. And when these algae blooms, some algae is toxic. And we've been seeing more and more of this throughout the years. And here is a map of all of the observed toxic algae toxins throughout the United States over a year. And so you can see how much we're seeing this, and including some where it's unsafe to drink, unsafe to swim. We have documents of people's pets getting into the water where you have this toxic algae and dying, cattle dying because of it. And it's a process, and that's exacerbated by climate change because things are warmer, longer. And so we're starting to see even more of this. And it's all, so much of it is due to the this nitrogen phosphorus pollution that isn't staying on the fields. It's not being taken up by plants. It's getting into our waters. So I was talking about it gets into the surface waters, and that's kind of what this map is showing. The amount of algae toxins that are in the surface water, lakes and streams. It also gets into the groundwater. And here is a little map, and I'm going to get rid of this a little bit so you can see, of all the states. And you can see that percentage, that's the percentage of groundwater that is contaminated with nitrates for each state. So just me living in Louisiana here, 15% of our groundwater is contaminated by nitrogen, by nitrate. And what does that mean? Well, nitrate causes quite a few things. The thing it's best known for is causing what's known as blue baby syndrome. And blue baby syndrome is basically something that particularly impacts infants, that the nitrate gets into their blood and it causes their blood to not be able to absorb oxygen. So they aren't getting enough oxygen in their blood and they start taking on a blue tint. And that's why it's called blue baby syndrome. And but that's not the only thing. Now nitrate is they're starting to find links to things like ALS and colorectal cancer and a bunch of other diseases and ailments due to this pollution, due to this nitrate pollution. So then we have this, I'm going to walk us through this again, right? We mined it, we drilled it, we processed it, we polluted the communities, we polluted the Gulf, we polluted the groundwater, we shipped it up to the Midwest, we put it on plants. The plants didn't take all of it up, and it washes into local waterways where it causes toxic algae blooms, where it causes problems with groundwater, causes problems with drinking water. And then eventually, it all gets into that Mississippi River drainage that drains 42% of the United States, and it comes down to the Gulf. And so the Gulf is insulted once again by this pollution in the form of the dead zone. And this is an area right here that has oxygen that's so low that that sea life needs to swim away or it dies. And so like fish can get away. Usually there's some impact to fish even when they're in this low oxygen areas, but shrimp and crabs and things like that, they will often suffocate and die. And again, this is caused by the nitrogen phosphorus is flowing down the Mississippi River and causes algae blooms. And here's a little graphic about that. Causes these algae blooms, the algae dies, bacteria eat up that algae, and when they eat up that algae, it uses up all the oxygen on the bottom. And so you have this area, the dead zone, also known as hypoxia, where you have so little oxygen that things die. And that can be an area on the bottom of the ocean along basically the entire Louisiana, getting into Texas, that is, we usually measure it in the size of states, and it's usually, I think the largest one was about the size of New Jersey. So if you think about that, if we had an area in the middle of the country the size of New Jersey where there wasn't enough oxygen that it could sustain life, we would do something about it, right? But since it's out in the Gulf, it does impact fishermen and shrimpers. But when you compare that to the agricultural industry, sometimes it just gets swept under the rug. But there are real implications to this. So that is kind of the end of this map tour. And once again, I encourage y'all to take a look at this and play with it, explore this. So much on this map is clickable. You can turn things on and off and really get an idea and focus in on where you live and get an idea. And then also with this tool, and I want to give a real big shout out to Rebecca, who's on the call, because she is, she worked really hard on this project as well, and really has dug in deep and really taken a look at, we go into much more detail of phosphate mining, of red tides, all of these things that we talked about, going into drilling for natural gas in the offshore. And I'm not going to bore y'all about reading this word for word, but there's so much information here. Fracking that we talked about, this just basically goes through the whole cycle again to really give you even more information. Everything is footnoted. This is an interesting map here that you can also play with on this tool. This is the Fraccidents map that Earth Justice prepared. And this just maps the accidents that have happened along with fracking. You can just go on and click on one of these, and it tells you this was an explosion of a crude oil train. I click down here. Let's take a look in Louisiana. A natural gas tank at a well production exploded that killed two Mississippi teens. So there are real impacts at every level of this. So yeah, you could spend just an hour just playing around with that map right there. Talking about fertilizer production, I was talking about Cancer Alley, and that's not the only area that's really impacted by this. But you go there, you can see these massive phosphogypsum stacks that are just there looming, literally looming over these communities, 200 feet tall. Some more pictures of, this is the mosaic gypsum stack. This is you can't really get a good picture from this, but this is a 200+ foot tall pile of radioactive waste, and it's just surrounded by fields. And one day, one of the farmers that leases one of these fields noticed, it seemed to him that the levee that's holding all of that toxic water in there was moving. And they, lo and behold, discovered that it was unstable, and they had to pump out a lot of that water. And where does that water go? They ended up having to pump some of it deep well, inject it, which has its own problems. And it wouldn't be surprised if they end up having to or wanting to put it into the Mississippi River. One of the things that they suggested doing was putting it into aerators, spraying that radioactive water up into the air and letting it evaporate. Luckily, EPA agreed with us, and that was not a good idea. Just moving through more about, here's a picture actually of the mosaic gyp stack, the known as the Uncle Sam stack, where it was collapsing. All about the runoff. Yeah, this is a sad picture of dogs swimming in toxic algae. One thing that I mentioned is this has a real cost too, a monetary cost, because if this nitrate gets into drinking water at levels too high, it needs to be treated. And if it's a public works, so for example, Des Moines, Iowa, in 2020, one of their two sources of drinking water were not usable for 110 days straight because of algae toxins that were in the water. Then a lot of times the rest of the year, they have high levels of nitrate that they can't use it. And they have is one of the most expensive water treatment systems in the country to remove that nitrate. it operates like, costs something like $1 million a month or something like that to operate that. To clean up the water, you have all these costs that are externalized that, the people that live in Des Moines, the waterworks serves, I think, 1/4 of the population of Iowa, and they are not causing the pollution, but they are being charged. They have to clean it up if they want to drink clean water. Here's a picture of the algae crisis that happened in Florida in 2018. This is something from the Environmental Working Group. They put together a database of all of the news articles about toxic algae blooms. And you can see just how they have grown, and the number of reportings have grown over the past 10 years. I talked about the nitrate as well, and then, the dead zone. It's something that we've been trying to push people to do things on for, well, just Healthy Golf is, we've been pushing for dead zone solutions since 1994, and we've made some progress, but we also keep spreading that fertilizer there and not having the controls to keep it on the fields, and we pay for it, and our fishermen down here pay for it. So I just talked gloom and doom here for about 40 minutes, because that's my job. That's what I do. I tell people about all of the awful things that we are trying to fight down here in the Gulf. But there are things people can do. And at the end of this, and I'm going to be posting this in the chat as well, is one thing that we're working with partners in Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, to start getting the EPA to address at least some of this pollution problem. And one thing is phosphorus, this phosphogypsum waste was exempted from a lot of hazardous waste rules, basically saying, oh, let's just not worry about that. And so we have been working with some of our partners to get EPA to finally at least start classifying this and treating it as waste, as a hazardous waste. And so we have petitioned EPA, and we're asking people to support us in that petition to tell EPA now is the time, with the collapses of Piney Point, with the toxic algae blooms that we're seeing, with the mosaic fertilizer pile being ruptured. We need to finally regulate this at least as hazardous waste. So I'll be posting this here, but if you want to click on it, you can just click on this, click anywhere to interact, and it lets you sign in your name here. So you can just put your name right down here at the bottom and add your name to tell EPA that you support regulating this waste as a hazardous waste. If you're curious where any of our information came from, I want all the data that I used was used by permission or was public data. Almost all of it was governmental public data, and what proprietary stuff we had, we got permission. And then you can look through all of our resources that Rebecca painstakingly documented. And I guess with that is a tour of this tool that we've put together to hopefully raise awareness of this huge cycle that's happening around the simple act of fertilizing the crops in the Midwest. So with that, I'm going to try and post a couple things in the chat. I'm going to I guess I'll keep this up, I think, to so I can still communicate with folks and show people around, but I'm going to take it down for a minute so I can post some things in the chat. So with that, I think Rebecca, Christian, have we been getting any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that presentation. And thank you to everybody who's listened in and spent some time with us on this. We've worked really hard on it, and hopefully you find this information compelling and useful. Lots of great questions, so I'll just start with one from Carol. When purchasing fertilizer, what nitrogen ingredients are most acceptable?
None. For a glib answer, you know, I mean, I guess it really depends. You know, at the very least with fertilizer, if you're talking about home fertilizer use, is at the very least follow the instructions on the bag. You know, each one has an NPK ratio in it, and you know, to be honest, lawns don't need to be fertilized. I remember growing up when I was in charge of mowing my lawn, I got super excited when it got too hot and all the grass burned off, because then I didn't have to mow anymore. And I'm still that way too. But you know, you know, and I don't want to sound glib, because that's not the, I don't want to be, but you know, we should not be fertilizing our lawns. And if you are, more does not mean better. And that, you know, you at least should be following the instructions that are on the bag, because most people over fertilize their lawns when they fertilize.
I have a question from Sandra. Fertilizer is considered very energy intensive, representing much of the energy use in all of crop production in LCAs. What stages of fertilizer production are the most energy intensive? The offshore drilling for gas, or what aspects of the actual production?
Ooh, that's a good question, and I'm not going to pretend to know the answer, because I haven't done haven't done the audit of that. But I would you know, I wouldn't be, I can't really say, you know, that, because I can document where the energy is coming from, because it's coming from, you know, mining operations and drilling operations. You know, the plants use a ton of energy, but then also you're talking about the diesel that's being used to transport it, and then also to apply it to these fields. It's just the energy used and the climate impact is just, again, it's as widespread as the pollution issue. Is that you know, that it's incredibly energy intensive. There, you're very right, but I don't know which is the most significant side of that.
I have a question from Blake. Why hasn't the Mosaic settlement with the EPA been directed to cleaning up the Uncle Sam plant? Oh, some questions came in. And other locations in Florida.
Could you say that one more time, Rebecca?
Oh, yes. Why hasn't the Mosaic settlement with the EPA been directed to cleaning up the Uncle Sam pile and other locations in Florida?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say two things are, one, there's probably not enough money in those settlements to necessarily do it correctly. Basically what it takes to do we don't know what to do with this waste. First of all, you know, you have the radioactive waste with a half-life of several thousands of years. And so that in itself is a problem. But at the very least, they need to be dewatered. You know, the water needs to be taken out, and then when that water needs to be treated, and it needs to be treated at a very high level, because we shouldn't be deep well injecting it. We shouldn't be exporting it to another place. So it needs to be treated with reverse osmosis or something akin to that. That is very, very expensive, and so companies don't want to do that because it's very expensive. And then after you dewater it, then you put clay and a soil cap on top of it, and you basically bury it. This isn't going away. There's an old pile in Abilene, Texas. I think it's Abilene, and they call it, it's known as the Abilene Alps, because it's just this big mountain in the middle of kind of these flat plains. Yeah, it's super expensive. Another example is Mississippi Phosphates in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That Mississippi Phosphates went bankrupt, and there was a trust fund that kind of was put aside to do environmental cleanups. Well, it was costing them $1 million a month to treat that water. and pretty soon that trust fund was used up, and it fell onto the state of Mississippi, their Department of Environmental Quality, to clean it up. Well, they didn't have the money to clean it up, so then it fell to EPA. Well, it finally has become a Superfund site, which means that now it's just the feds are on the hook to clean it up, but it's going to be a long process. And again, it's going to be capping it and just hoping it doesn't, erode away and rupture at a later date. That's one of the problems with especially the phosphate side of things is, we've created this waste, so we need to stop creating more. And once we stop, and then we need to clean up what we have, and then we need to be continuing to look for solutions to do what we will with the solid waste. And it might be just bury it and keep it in place, which is not ideal, but yeah, it's just a tough question.
I have a question from Jim. Do you think Florida's basin management plans will be effective in reducing nitrogen in its waters?
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Could you read that again? Should turn that off.
Do you think Florida's basin management plans will be effective in reducing nitrogen in its waters?
I've participated a little bit in some of those plans, and I think that they're a piece in the puzzle. Do I think that they're going to be effective in cleaning it up? No, I don't. Florida developed nitrogen and phosphorus criteria a few years ago, basically the limit on how much nitrogen and phosphorus that can be in different Florida waters. And we don't think that they're protective enough to actually clean up these waters. And a lot of it comes down to funding as well, that these basin plans would really need to be funded. And but I don't think that there is enough money in these plans to actually actuating the cleanup of these waters. I mean, I think that they're good in that they bring attention to the watersheds and they help leverage funds that are there, but I don't think that those are going to get us to where we need to be, especially, as we speak, there is an application for expanding one of the phosphate mines in Florida. And so until we stop creating more of this pollution, it's going to be hard to make significant reductions.
Question from Michael. Obviously, the annual tillage of the Midwest has ruined much of the topsoil, causing the need for fertilizer inputs to maintain yields. How can we make compelling arguments to farmers, food distributors, consumers, institutions, etc., within supply chain to further regenerative agricultural practices so we are less dependent on fertilizer inputs? What are your thoughts on how this can be incentivized?
That's a lot of questions, and a lot of big questions there. And I'll try to take a stab at it. Right now, the way that we treat agriculture is, it's very, very industrial. It's very commodity based. It's just how many pounds of number 2 corn do you produce, and it's also relatively highly subsidized and regulated as far as prices. But there isn't much incentive. A lot of I think a good first step is trying to stop externalizing these costs. Fertilizer, these fertilizer companies, one option would be to hold them accountable for actually paying for the costs of cleanup of a lot of this pollution. And so, and legally, I don't know how that would work, but basically, fertilizer should be more expensive because of all the externalized costs that it creates. And if you have more expensive fertilizer, farmers are going to will look for alternatives to synthetic fertilizer. Additionally, a lot of farmers are subsidized in their use of agricultural insurance. It's kind of we used to have direct payment subsidies, and now it's kind of gone the insurance route in the Farm Bill. But a lot of those people that receive federal funds aren't required to take care of their land and necessarily. And I'm certain this is not me calling out that that farmers are poor stewards, because they are not. I grew up surrounded by farms in Illinois. I know the deal, but if you are receiving federal funds, you should be held to some basic standards of care, in that you should be using cover crops, you should be using grass waterways, you should be restricting livestock from your from waterways. You should not be spreading manure on frozen ground. Some of these basic things that should be required. I know I hate to say the big R word, the regulation rule word, but I think that there needs to be some of that accountability. And also some empowerment of tenant farmers, because a lot of the farms throughout the Midwest are not actually owned by the people that farm them. They're owned by absentee landlords or very large landowners. And so even if a farmer wants to do the right thing, they are kind of held at the mercy of the owner of the land that they farm. And so, I think regenerative agriculture is going to have to be the wave of the future, because we are using up our topsoil. Like was said, we are using up the nutrients that are in what soil we have left, and but we need to get away from this corn and soybeans. We should be planting more food that we can actually eat. I don't know if people, again, I grew up surrounded by cornfields. We didn't drink the well water from my house, and I never knew growing up why. It wasn't until I started doing this work 10 years ago, I was like, oh, it's because we had nitrate pollution in our well water that I wasn't able to drink the water growing up. And if anybody has actually gone out into a field of corn and tried to eat that corn out there, I feel sorry for you, because that is not edible corn. That is used for fuel, and that is used for feeding animals. And so, I think another thing that we need to be incentivizing more for farmers to be planting food that we can eat. I think that's me editorializing a little bit. That's not necessarily Healthy Golf's message necessarily, but I think that's a place that we need to start and let people have responsibility and have really ownership over the land that they farm.
Great. Thank you for those answers. We're at 6:59 at this point. We started a little late. I don't know if we have time for one or two more questions, but if not, I'm going to hand it back over to Christian.
Yeah, I can do one more, but before I do, I just posted 3 things in the chat. Once again, I posted a link to the tool. I linked link to take action and tell EPA that we should be regulating phosphogypsum waste as a hazardous material. And then also I posted something on that we're coming up on the Give New Orleans Day, and it's a kind of a citywide fundraising event, and you don't have to live in New Orleans to do it. And I know a couple people that are on this call have already given. But if you go to that website and want to donate to the work that we're doing to try to push for better policies and advocate for the cleaner Gulf and cleaner communities, we really appreciate that, and a little money can really go a long way in a small organization like ours. So I just wanted to give that short plug. And Rebecca, I think we can do one more question.
Sure. Okay. I see there are a lot of different questions on how this is going to impact future generations. So is there anything that you can talk about in terms of future impacts and solutions to those impacts, kind of as a wrap up?
Future impacts to what impacts?
So I have a question from Jeannie. saying fracking is now known to predispose areas fracked to weaken and experience earthquakes where there were never any. Once drilled and fracked, these drilling points can never be adequately plugged to prevent earthquakes going forward. If there were a cost to future generations by leaving them with quake-prone land, what would that be? Could there even be a cost assigned to such a long-lasting legacy?
Well, let's see that. I mean, this environmental economics is kind of a nature-based economics is kind of a burgeoning field right now. You know, looking at both true cost damage and then also giving credit for environmental services, for ecosystem services that that nature provides, whether it's flood protection, wildlife habitat, fish, all that kind of stuff. So as far as quantifying the impacts to the seismic activity of fracking, yeah, that's be a pretty tough one. You'd have to look at you know, the potential impacts to, you know, homes and things like that, I would think, to get a general idea of just from that. But you know, I think, but there are more quantifiable things when it comes to fracking, especially just is the fugitive emissions and the contributions to climate change. You know, we can put dollars to that, and that should not be externalized anymore. So, and also I am kind of come from a school of you know, kind of a first do no harm school of environmentalism, I guess. And you know, that's we have the natural gas is incredibly cheap right now. We don't need to be drilling like we are right now. And if we are going to achieve, you know, if we want to live on the coast as they are right now, we need to be making some drastic changes. And those changes include tapering off and stopping our natural gas and oil drilling. And so we need to be, and since that natural gas goes to a lot of this fertilizer that again contributes to climate change, I think, I know I'm getting a little bit off the topic, but as far as to quantifying the price to future generations, well, you know, there a lot of these coastal areas aren't going to be there in 50 years, and if we continue on this road, the sea levels are still going to keep rising. So that's, and some of these areas are not going to be livable anymore. So that's that's a real cost that we need to, that's going to be passed on to our children if we don't do something soon.
Great.
Well, I think
Thank you. I'm going to hand it back over to Christian now.
awesome. Yeah, thanks. Thanks everybody. Thanks to all of you who attended this evening. This was obviously a topic of great interest. We had 50 people joining us tonight, so that's fantastic. I will send an email out to everybody, as I just said in the chat, with links to, again, that the links that Matt shared, and also a link to the video if you want to go back and watch some of that. And then I think if Matt's okay with it, I'll include his email. I'm sure it is. And you can follow up specifically if you have more questions for him in detail. There was some great conversation in the chat as well. I was following along with some of that. So I appreciate input from those who seem to have some pretty detailed knowledge about regenerative agriculture and soil and so many issues that tie into all of this. So thanks again to Rebecca for monitoring the chat, and that's doing a great job with the questions. Thanks to all of you for asking great questions. And thanks again to Matt for presenting this tonight and helping to put it all together. Just a reminder to everybody, we are Healthy Gulf, and you can go to our website and either join, become a member, or you can also sign up for free updates. We'll send occasional emails to you, updating you on various issues affecting the Gulf of Mexico and the communities along its shores as well. So we'd love to have you do that, and love to keep you posted on other events and activities coming up. We'll be doing more events like this in the months ahead, and we'd love to have you join us for some more. So thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everybody.